The wolves came for the settlement's meat in the third week of January 1768, and by the time the snow stopped falling, 4 families along Northkill Creek had lost most of what was meant to carry them to spring. They found the smokehouse door of the Kaufman place torn from its leather hinges, the hams dragged into the drifts, the bacon gone. Down the valley, the Zug family's cured pork had spoiled after a January thaw softened it, and a hard refreeze split it through, and now it hung gray and sour in the cold. But in the small log cabin of the widow Barbara Byler, there was no torn door and no ruined meat, because Barbara did not keep her meat in a shed 40 paces from her home. She kept it in a chamber of fieldstone dug beneath her own floor, reached through a trap door beside her hearth, and on the worst night of that winter, she lifted a ham down by lamplight without once setting foot in the storm. Her 3 children ate smoked pork and cornmeal while the wind screamed against the chinking. The strange stone cellar her neighbors had called a widow's foolishness, the thing the deacon had warned would burn her family in their sleep, was the only reason the Bylers were not hungry. 6 months earlier, the whole settlement had laughed. No one was laughing now. Barbara Byler had buried her husband Christian in the spring of 1767, when a felled oak kicked back off its stump and struck him across the chest, and he lived only 2 days after. He left her 130 acres of frontier ground in the Amish settlement along Northkill Creek in Berks County, a cabin of 16 logs to a wall, a good spring, 11 hogs, a milk cow, and 3 children who still needed feeding. Daniel was 11 and steady. Katie was 8. Little Eli was 4 and understood only that his father did not come in for supper anymore. Barbara was 34 years old, and she knew the arithmetic of a frontier winter the way she knew her own hands. A family in that country lived or died by the autumn butchering. When the cold came hard enough to keep the meat from turning, the hogs were slaughtered, and every pound of that pork had to be salted, smoked, and stored well enough to last until the gardens came back in May. A poorly cured ham spoiled by February, a smokehouse robbed by wolves or men left a family with nothing but cornmeal and prayer. And a widow alone faced a harder problem still, because the settlement's way, the way it had always been done, put the smokehouse well apart from the dwelling, out where a fire could not spread to the home. That distance was sensible for a household with a man and grown sons to tend it. For a woman alone, it was a trap. She could not stand, watch over a smoldering fire 40 paces off through the night, and also nurse a sick child, and she could not break a path through waist-deep snow to reach her winter meat and leave 3 little ones alone by the hearth. The people would help her. That was the promise and the burden of the church. Barbara knew that if she failed, the deacon would see her fed, that families would bring what they could spare, that no widow among the Amish was left to starve. But she had watched charity settle over a woman like a second widowhood, had seen how a person could become a thing the community carried rather than a person who carried her own weight, and she did not want that for her children or herself. She wanted a system a woman could work alone. She had until the first hard freeze of autumn to build one, and it was already June. Old Mose Zug rode his mule up her lane in the last week of June, on his way back from the mill, and stopped to offer the counsel that old men on the frontier gave whether it was wanted or not. He was 61, had buried 2 wives, and outlived most of the men who came to the Northkill with him, and he had cured more pork than any 3 households in the settlement. He looked at her hogs and did the same arithmetic she had done. "You'll want your smokehouse standing by September," he said. "A ham wants 6 weeks in the salt before it ever sees smoke, and the smoke wants a fortnight after that. Low and cool, hickory or apple, never pine, or you'll taste the pitch till Easter. 11 hogs is a great deal of meat for a woman to cut and cure and hang by herself, Barbara. A smokehouse belongs 40 paces off, always has, on account of fire. You build it close and careless, and you'll wake with your roof alight and your children under it. He shook his head. You'd do better to sell down to 4 hogs and let the church see you through the rest. There's no shame in a widow leaning on the people. Barbara had grown up in a curing house. Her own father had smoked hams for half of Lancaster County before he brought the family north, and she had salted and hung meat since she was Katie's age. She knew Mose was right about the salt and the smoke and the hickory. She also knew he was wrong about the distance, because the distance was exactly the thing that would kill a woman alone. But she only thanked him, because there is no profit in arguing a design a man cannot yet see. The trouble with the settlement's way was not the smoking. The trouble was everything around it. A smokehouse 40 paces off meant a path to break after every storm. It meant a fire to tend at a distance from her sleeping children. It meant meat left overnight, where a bear or a wolf or a hungry drifter could take it. And men did go hungry on that frontier, and hungry men took what they found. And it meant that in the deep of winter, when the snow lay 4 feet on the level and the wind cut like a scythe, a widow had to choose between her fire and her food. Barbara had seen a woman 2 settlements over freeze within sight of her own door, turned around in a whiteout between the house and the barn. The distance that protected a family from fire was the same distance that killed the ones who had no man to cross it for them. She did not need a better smokehouse. She needed to bring the smokehouse home. The idea came to her while she was down in her root cellar in early July, standing in the steady cool that the earth held even in high summer. The cellar under the cabin stayed near the same coolness the year round, well above freezing in the coldest weather and far below the July heat, because 3 feet of Pennsylvania ground is a slow and patient thing. That coolness was already keeping her butter and her cider and her turnips. It could keep her meat. What if the smokehouse and the cellar were the same room? She could dig the cellar out wider and deeper, line the walls in fieldstone laid up in clay, and set into one corner a firebox of stone with its own flue drawn straight up alongside the cabin's chimney to carry the smoke out above the roof. She could hang the salted hams and sides from the joists overhead, feed a low smolder of hickory and apple in the stone box, and the cool of the earth would hold the chamber below blood warmth, so the smoke cured the meat slowly instead of cooking it. Cold smoke was the whole secret of a ham that kept. Warm smoke spoiled it. The buried chamber gave her cold for nothing. And when the smoking was done, that same stone room became the larder. The cured meat would hang in a cool, dry, steady dark, off the ground, behind a stout door and under her own floor, where no wolf could reach it and no thief could find it, and no January thaw could soften it, because 3 feet of earth does not thaw in January. She could take a ham down through the trap door in her stocking feet, with a storm howling overhead. She could feed her fire and feed her children without ever choosing between them. The danger was the one Mose had named: fire under a house of logs. But fire under a house of logs was a danger only if the box that held it was wood, and Barbara's box would be stone, the firebox stone, the walls stone, the flue stone, and clay drawn up and away so the smoke never touched the living air above. Stone does not burn. A properly drawn flue does not smoke the room it serves. She would answer the fear of fire with the one material fire cannot eat. She sketched it out on a shingle with a bit of charcoal, and then she began to figure what it would cost her in stone and sweat and summer, which was the only currency she had. She started digging in the 2nd week of July, when the ground was dry and the days ran long. The old cellar was a shallow square, barely deep enough to stand in. She meant to widen it to 12 feet by 10 and take it down another 3, and every basket of earth had to come up the ladder and out the door on her own back. Because Daniel could dig, but could not yet lift a man's load, and the little ones could only carry the smaller stones and stay out from underfoot. She dug in the early mornings before the heat, and again in the long evenings, and in the middle of the day she did the work that could not wait, the garden and the cow and the hogs and the churning and the endless watching of a 4-year-old near a creek. The fieldstone she gathered from her own ground, which the frontier provided in cruel abundance, prying it loose from the pasture with a bar and stone boat, and hauling it down by the cow. She laid the walls up herself, bedding each stone in clay she puddled by hand, learning as she went the way a wall wants to lean into itself to stand. It was slow, because everything was slow, when one pair of hands did the work of 4. By the end of July, she had the chamber dug and half the walls laid, and she had a deficit growing in another ledger entirely, because every day spent lining a cellar was a day not spent cutting the 8 cords of firewood a Pennsylvania winter would burn, and a day not spent laying by the garden's harvest against the cold. Word of the widow's digging reached the settlement, as all things did, and in the first week of August, the preacher Gideon Esch walked out to see it for himself. He was a careful, kindly man of 50, ordained by lot as the people chose their ministers, and he carried the weight of watching over the souls in his district. He stood at the mouth of her cellar and looked down at the stone and the beginnings of the flue with plain worry on his face. "Barbara," he said, in the gentle voice a man uses to turn someone back from a cliff, "I have known a house fire to take a family in the time it takes to wake. You mean to keep a fire burning beneath the very floor your children sleep upon? I do not doubt your cleverness. I doubt the wisdom of it. Fire and home are meant to be kept apart, as the smokehouse is kept apart, and there is a reason our fathers built it so. And I will say the harder thing, because it falls to me to say it. There is a pride that hides in cleverness. When a woman sets herself apart with a contrivance no one else has, when she will not simply let the people carry her, as the people are glad to do, I fear for her heart as much as her roof. Gelassenheit, Barbara. Yieldedness. Let the church be your smokehouse. Let us cure your meat with our own, as we would for any widow." It was the hardest thing anyone said to her that whole summer, because it was said in love, and it carried a truth she could not entirely deny. There was pride in it. She wanted to stand on her own, and wanting to stand on your own is not the same as humility, but Barbara had prayed over exactly this, on her knees on the dirt floor of the half-dug cellar, and she had come up believing that providing for her children with the wit God gave her was not pride, but stewardship, and that a design which might one day keep other widows from being carried was a gift to the people rather than a rejection of them. She could not prove that to Gideon Esch with a shingle and a sketch. She could only prove it with a winter, so she bowed her head to the reproof and thanked him for his care, and kept digging. If you are finding something worth keeping in these accounts of plain people and frontier ingenuity, take a moment to leave a like. It helps these stories reach others who still believe there is wisdom in the old ways. Now back to Barbara's cellar. At the settlement store, where the Amish traded eggs and butter for salt and iron, Mattie Zug had opinions on Barbara's project and shared them freely. She was Moses' daughter-in-law, 52, sharp as a fro, and she had survived hard years by minding the accounts and the gossip both. When Barbara came in to buy the great quantity of salt and saltpeter her curing would need, and the iron hooks to hang the meat, Mattie weighed the salt out slow and did not keep her thoughts behind her teeth. "Folks are talking, you know," she said. "A widow digging under her own house like a badger. They're saying you've gone strange with grief. They're saying you'll spend your husband's stock of coin on stone and salt and have neither meat nor money by spring. And then who carries you? Us. A woman ought not to draw eyes, Barbara, and you're drawing every eye in the district. She tied off the salt. I've seen prideful folk lose everything out here on a notion. My own father-in-law will tell you. You'd best have this right, because there's no second try at a winter. The words stung, because a portion of them was true. Barbara had come to the North Kill with her husband's small hoard of hard coin, and it had dwindled through the summer into stone and salt and iron and the hire of a mason's help for the flue, the one part she did not trust to her own hand. She was gambling the whole of her family's security on a design no one had built and no one believed. If she was wrong, Maddie had the shape of it exactly. Debt, dependence, and shame, and a return to being carried. But if she was right, she would have something Maddie's caution could never give a widow, which was a way to stand. She paid for the salt with coin she had earned, spinning wool through the spring evenings, and she left without defending herself, because a defense is only words, and words had never yet kept a ham through February. Through August, she laid the rest of the stone and drew the flue. The flue was the delicate work, the narrow stone throat that had to carry the smoke up and out with a strong enough draw that not a wisp of it slipped back into the cabin. And here she paid a settlement, mason 2 days' labor, and 3 of her hens to set it true beside the cabin's own chimney. When it was done, she built a small fire of shavings in the stone box and watched the smoke climb the flue and stand up straight from the roof into the August sky. And not one thread of it came through the trapdoor into her kitchen. She wept a little then, standing in the cool stone room, though she would not have told anyone so. Her neighbor Samuel Fisher rode by that week with a haunch of venison he claimed he could not use, which was a kindness dressed as a trade, for no one on the frontier had venison to spare in August. He was 38, a widower himself these 3 years, quiet in the way of a man who had learned not to spend words he did not have. He looked a long while at the stone chamber and the standing smoke. "That will draw," he said, which from Samuel was high praise. "You've cut the wood you'll need." Mose says 8 cord. 3 cord cut, Barbara admitted. The seller took the summer I'd have spent at the wood pile. Samuel did not argue, but she saw the worry cross him. He had brought the venison because he suspected her children were eating thin while she poured her summer into stone, and the sharpness of little Eli's wrists confirmed it. He said only that he would send his eldest boy over to help split wood on the Saturdays, and he did, and Barbara added the venison to a pot that fed her children for 4 days, and did not let herself cry twice in 1 week. The butchering came with the first hard freeze in the 2nd week of November, cold enough to keep the meat while she worked it. Samuel and 2 of his sons came to help with the killing, because that was the people's way whatever the deacon thought of her cellar. And 11 hogs is more than 1 woman can handle in the killing. But the curing was hers alone, and here all her father's teaching came back to her hands. She rubbed each ham and side and shoulder with a mixture of salt and a measure of saltpeter, packed them in the salt in troughs of hollowed log, and let them draw in the cold for 6 weeks, turning them and resalting as the brine wept out, because it is the salt and not the smoke that first makes meat keep, and a ham hurried out of the salt is a ham that rots from the bone outward. When the salt had done its work near Christmas, she hung the hams and bacon and shoulders from the joists of her stone chamber and lit her first true smoke. She fed it hickory and apple wood she had split and dried through the autumn, never a stick of pine, and she kept the fire to a low red smolder so the smoke rose cool through the hanging meat, curling around the hams and out the flue. Down in the earth-cooled room, the smoke never warmed past the temper of a spring morning, which was exactly as it should be, for cold smoke dries and seasons and seals a ham, while warm smoke only cooks the outside and sours the middle. She could tend that fire in her stocking feet at midnight with the trap door open at her elbow and her children asleep 10 steps away. She fed it for a fortnight, and the hams took on the deep amber of well-smoked pork, and then she let them hang in the cool dark to keep. By the middle of December, she had the winter's meat cured and stored beneath her own floor, dry and cold and close, and 8 cord of wood she had scraped together late with Samuel's boys, and a settlement that still shook its head at the badger widow of the Northkill. The winter of 1768 turned cruel after Christmas. Snow came deep in the first week of January and lay 4 feet on the level, and then the wind rose and drove it into drifts that buried fences and reached the eaves of the low cabins. The creek froze solid enough to bear a loaded sled. And then came the thing that ruined the settlement's meat, a false thaw in the second week of January, 3 days of warm wind that softened everything the cold had held, followed by a hard black refreeze that split the poorly cured hams through and let the rot in. Families who had smoked their meat, warm, and hurried it out of the salt, found it turning gray and sour on the hooks. The Zug family lost half their pork that way. 2 households sickened from eating meat they should have thrown out, because a family that has lost its winter meat does not throw meat away. Then the wolves came, bold with hunger, down out of the ridges into the settlement itself. They tore the door from the Kaufman Smokehouse in the night and dragged the hams into the snow, and by morning the family's winter was gone. 2 other smokehouses standing apart from their homes were raided the same week, because a smokehouse 40 paces off in a hard winter is a larder no one can guard. And through all of it, a blizzard shut the valley in, so that a family could not break a path to a neighbor, let alone to town, and every household was thrown back on exactly what lay within its own walls. Within Barbara's walls lay the winter's meat. On the worst night, when the wind came so hard the fire guttered in the draft, and little Eli burned with a fever that frightened her, she did not have to choose between her sick child and her food. She lifted the trapdoor beside the hearth, went down into the stone chamber, where the hams hung cold and sound and safe, brought up what she needed, and fed both the fire and the children without once opening the outer door onto the killing cold. The earth held her meat above the thaw and below the wolves. The stone held her fire away from the logs. She kept the cabin warm, and her children fed through 4 days of storm. And when Eli's fever broke on the 3rd night, it broke in a warm room with a full belly, which is where fevers are most likely to break. When the storm cleared and the settlement dug itself out, the accounting was grim. 4 families had lost most of their meat to spoilage, or wolves. 1 old man 2 farms over had died, trying to reach his own smokehouse in the whiteout, turned around within sight of his door, and the widow Byler, whom the whole district had called a fool, had a cellar full of sound-smoked pork and 3 warm children, and enough to share, which she did, sending Daniel out on snowshoes with a ham for the Kaufmans and a side of bacon for the sickened Zugs the moment a path could be broken. Mose Zug came to see it with his own eyes when he could travel again. He stood at the trap door a long time, looking down at the stone chamber and the hanging hams that had come through the winter that ruined his own. "How did yours keep when mine spoiled?" he asked at last, and it cost the old man something to ask it. "Cold smoke and the earth's cold after," Barbara said. "The thaw never reached it. 3 feet of ground does not thaw in January." Mose was quiet a while. "I was wrong about the distance," he said finally. "I built mine apart for the fire, and the fire never came, but the wolves did, and the thaw did, and my meat is gone, and yours is not. I do not like being wrong at 61. But I am wrong, and it is a fool who will not say so." He looked at the stone flue drawn up beside her chimney. "You built it, so it cannot burn." "That was the whole of it," Barbara said. Even Gideon Esch came and stood in her kitchen, and reframed it in the only terms his office allowed, "I feared pride in you," he said, "and I was watching for the wrong sin. What I see is a woman who provided for the fatherless out of the wit the Lord gave her, and then fed her neighbors from the surplus. If that is pride, we could use more of it. And then, because he was an honest man, I will help the next widow build one, if you will show me how." Word of the widow's meat traveled beyond the settlement that spring, and a meat buyer named Josiah Coates rode out from the English town of Reading, where he supplied the taverns, because he had heard there was pork on the North Kill that kept perfect through the worst winter in memory. He was a hard man to impress, having bought and sold cured meat for 20 years, and he came expecting the story to be exaggerated. Barbara cut him a slice from a ham that had hung since Christmas, and he chewed it slow, and his eyebrows went up. "I've bought hams from the best curing houses in Philadelphia that didn't keep like this," he said. "No thaw taint, no rancid edge, no bone sour. What's your trick, widow?" And when she told him, the salt drawn slow and full, the cold smoke of hickory and apple, the buried stone that held the meat below the thaw, he shook his head like a man who has seen something obvious he should have thought of himself. He bought every ham she could spare at a price that paid back her summer of stone in a single afternoon, and promised to take all she could cure the next year, which made the strange seller not only her larder, but her living. Barbara had not invented anything new under the sun, though she had never seen it done. The German folk her grandparents came from had built smoke chambers into the very chimneys of their houses, the Rauchkammer, where hams hung in the rising flue smoke of the hearth below, for the same reason she had, to bring the smoke and the meat inside the walls, where the weather and the wolves could not reach. The principles were older than the settlement, older than the church, because the problem was universal and the physics did not change with the country. Keep the meat close. Draw the moisture with salt. Seal it with cool smoke. Store it cold and guarded. Answer fire with stone. Good solutions arrive wherever the same hard problem is faced by people willing to look at it plainly. And they work not because they are clever, but because they are true. If you have come this far, and if you believe as we do, that this kind of practical wisdom is worth remembering, the knowledge that kept plain families alive through winters that would frighten us now, then subscribe to this channel. We are gathering these accounts of frontier ingenuity and quiet resilience, so they are not lost, so that the next generation understands what real self-reliance looked like and what it cost. Your subscription keeps these stories alive. Now, how it ended for Barbara Byler, and the strange fate of the thing she built. Barbara Byler never sought a name for what she had done, and being Amish, she would have refused one had it been offered. She only kept curing her meat in the stone room under her floor, answering questions when they were asked, and helping when a neighbor came to dig his own. Within 3 winters, half the households along the North Kill had brought their smokehouses home, some lining their cellars in stone as she had, some building the smoke chamber into the chimney in the old German way. Preacher Esch kept his word and helped 2 more widows build theirs. Mo Zug built one himself and died warm and well-fed at 74, telling anyone who would listen that the Badger widow had been right and he had been wrong, which was as close to praise as the old man ever came. The design spread until it stopped being remarkable, absorbed so completely into the way things were done that within a generation, the young people assumed it had always been so. Barbara lived to be an old woman in that same valley, and her obituary in the district almanac noted her long service to the church and her many grandchildren, and said nothing at all about the stone chamber that had kept her family through the winter of 1768. The innovation became invisible through its own success, which is the quiet fate of nearly every good idea that ever saved a life. Her neighbors had laughed at the widow who dug beneath her own house like a badger. Right up until the winter the wolves came, and the thaw ruined the meat of every family that had done it the old way. After that, they stopped laughing, and they started digging. Because wisdom on the frontier was never about tradition or appearance or what the neighbors would say. It was about what held when the snow lay 4 feet deep and the wolves came down from the ridges and there was no one coming to help. Barbara Byler understood that a good design is only pride until the storm proves it mercy. She answered the fear of fire with stone, and the fear of hunger with salt, and cold smoke, and the patient cold of the earth. And she kept her children fed through a winter that beat stronger households to their knees. Sometimes the strangest thing your neighbors ever saw is only the truth arriving a little before they were ready for it. And the truth does not care who laughs. It only cares what keeps.